Alrighty, so this is my presentation on live organ transplantation, the history of a medical miracle. So some background on why I wanted to do organ transplant as my final project for this class. I became a bilateral lung transplant patient and recipient at the age of 20 due to a rare disease that I contracted at age 9. That rare disease was called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and it basically destroyed about 50% of my lung tissue. Lung tissue is one of the few that does not grow back and it cannot be healed. So a lot of people who have lung disease, or especially if you smoke, you will not recover any of that lung function. And I was transplanted back in July of 2018. So while organ transplant is not a super common procedure to have done for the general populace, you more than likely know someone who has had or will need a transplant in the future. And that's because over 100,000 people are currently waiting for organ transplant as of February of 2021. And although there's that many people on the wait list, and likely most people know someone who has or will need a transplant, and 80% of people agree that organ transplant is a vital medical practice, only about 50% of people in the United States will designate themselves as organ donors. So I would highly encourage anyone who sees this video who is not an organ donor, please, the next time that you go to the DMV to get your license updated, just check that box, get the heart on your license, and you will more than likely save a few lives in the process. So to the meat and bones of what this slideshow is. What is organ transplant? So an organ transplant is when an organ of some sort is transplanted from one donor to a recipient in a surgical procedure. Simple enough, but very complicated in practice. There can be both living and deceased donors, and then sometimes donors are actually themselves. A lot of people who have had ACL reconstruction surgery have used tendons or ligaments from other parts of their body. People who have had severe burns can even use some skin from other parts of their body to heal those major burns. There are two different types of organs that are considered transplantable: primary and tissue. So the five primary organs that can be transplanted or donated are heart, liver, lung, kidney, and pancreas. And then the types of skin or tissues that can be donated or transplanted are the skin, heart valves, tendons, bones, veins, cartilage, the middle ear, and then parts of the eye. And unfortunately, there's nothing on the near horizon for the brain or for restoring vision at this point in time. But medical advancements are coming so quickly that you never know what's on the next horizon. So in the United States, organ transplant is relatively simple in how the cogs turn and how organ transplant actually works. So we split our country up into 6 separate regions. Some of the states up in the Northwest make up Region 6, which is where I currently live. The other states near the Southwest then make up another region. South Central makes up a third region. Middle Central makes up a fourth. Same thing goes for East Coast, with the North and South making up the last 2 of the 6 regions. The reason that this is important is because each region is responsible for not only supplying hospitals capable of doing transplantation, but they're also responsible for staffing in terms of specializing their transplant teams. And then only certain hospitals will actually be approved to do certain transplants. And that's just based off of the danger levels for the recipients of those transplants and the difficulty to do those transplants. And that's going to vary based off of what each patient is going to be experiencing, their underlying diseases, the difficulty and the process required to actually perform those surgeries. And then based off of who is actually available is going to dictate what those hospitals can do. So in Region 6, where I live, which is in Washington State, we take both Alaska and Hawaii, and then we also take on the mainland Washington, Oregon, northern Idaho, and Montana in our region. And we in Seattle, Washington, have the only lung transplant hospital in the University of Washington. One of the other main hospitals that does transplants in the region is also going to be Harborview Medical, but they see a lot of the burn patients. They're going to do a little bit more of the tissue transplant. And then they're also going to do more of the hearts. Heart is becoming a pretty common procedure to be done. So even some of the smaller hospitals that aren't considered research hospitals can now do things. But for the most part, especially in places like Washington and in California, you're going to see the transplant hospitals that do the primary organs mainly be the research hospitals attached to like UCLA, University of Washington, or Loyola Marymount supplies a lot of the doctors for that as well. So you're basically going to see the schools in LA or in Seattle for the two West Coast regions doing transplants. So pre-transplant medicine, and then specifically relating that medicine to surgery. Originally, people became interested in our internal workings at the dawn of man. So back in Mesopotamia, people started taking interest in how we worked, and then they would basically take their dead um, family members or tribe members and try to discern either why they died or what was going on inside. That slowly progressed up to about 600 BC and early imperial Egypt, where we started to get a little bit more methodical in our process for this. So, in ancient cultures like imperial Egypt, we studied the internals of the human body pretty extensively. Ancient runes depict how these invasive procedures and ancient surgical tools have been found in tombs for embalming and then also for the scientific study depicted in the runes. Basically, they would just try and take apart whatever they could and then determine what it did, why it did it, and then determine how it actually went through the process. So if you were looking at things like the intestines, they determined that stomach acid broke down food and then supplied energy to the body. Pretty simple, but for the time, it was pretty advanced. Then you get to the true start of surgery in about 600 BC with Ayurveda of India. And I don't know if I pronounced his name right, but he's considered the father of surgery. And he wrote a series of volumes which he detailed the examination, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis of numerous ailments that he was able to treat. And then he was actually one of the few people that started doing cosmetic surgeries during that time. So he definitely started the real surgery push in around 600 BC. Then we progressed to early modern Europe, and the medical scene saw some of the biggest advancements in surgery, where gunshot wounds, stab wounds, and some of the more major ailments could start to be fixed. And that was basically assuming that someone survived the infections, that the surgeries would quote unquote work, because most people were unfortunately killed by the surgery, not necessarily their wounds in the end. And that's just because we didn't see bacteria, so we didn't know that we had to actually kill it off after surgery. Then we started to get into the more modern medical practice and surgery, which started in around 1715 through 1789. And this was during the Enlightenment period in Europe. And this is where just tendons, ligaments, muscles, and anything major could start to be surgically treated and fixed. And survival rates continued to rise, but the infection rates were still really significant. And it was a confounding factor for a lot of doctors. And that's just because we didn't know how to really truly sterilize our wounds, much less sterilize after a major surgery. And then in addition to that, we didn't have things like anesthesia. So doctors were basically butchers at the time, told to get the job done as quickly as they could just to end the suffering that the patient was going through during surgery. So then we get to around 1840 and the 19th century, which is when things really started to kick off and we could see the light at the end of the tunnel and get to where we actually would start to recognize surgery. So in 1840, we actually invented anesthesia, which allowed surgeons to take their time and do a proper job with fixing the human body. And that was a huge deal because otherwise the patient was awake, and a rush procedure for a heart surgery or any internal organ is never a good thing. In addition to that, we started seeing things like anesthetics and antibiotics, which were a huge improvement on survival rates because that was what killed most people outside of the surgery itself. And then After that, we started seeing x-rays in around 1895, and we were able to determine before we went in what was going on, what was wrong, and that would basically put us to where we could really start to just hone in our medical practices for surgery. So now we get to the history of organ transplant. First transplant that was successful was done as a kidney transplant in 1954, and it was done on the Herrick brothers, who were identical twins, one being a living donor and one being a recipient. This is important because it was less than 60 years from the time that we just discovered x-rays to the time that we were starting to put living organs from one person into another person. So obviously medical science is moving at an extreme pace. And then we start to see things in 1967. So about 13 years after that, the first liver transplant is done and a new foundation is formed. So the Southeast Organ Procurement Foundation was formed originally in 1968, and they were basically in charge of who got organs, why, and then also matching those organs from the donor to the recipient. So a huge job for a relatively small group of doctors. And in 1977, they realized that they no longer had the capabilities to keep up with the transplants. So they made a new system called the United Network of Organ Sharing. And that is now known as UNOS. And it's probably the biggest international group that does organ transplant matching. And they're extremely helpful in pushing for awareness and then also for fundraising for organ transplant research. And they've saved a lot of lives in the process of what they're doing. So if we jump back to shortly after the organ donation center is established, you're going to see the first heart lung transplant performed in 1981. So I guess actually shortly after UNOS is formed. But you're going to see the first heart and lung transplant performed. And then basically for the next 10 years, major jumps in our capabilities of performing transplants. And you're going to start to see a lot more live donor transplants done, which is a huge advancement because before we couldn't actually remove an organ from a living human being and have them survive. So obviously both surgery and transplant medicine are taking off at this point in time. Then we get to the 1990s, and UNOS is basically preparing the first comprehensive survival report for people. And in 1987, they were just starting to create and collect data on donors and recipients to improve their outcomes. So then in 1999, the UNET transplant database was launched, and it basically managed the matching of all organs and organized transplant data for the nation. All this is important because without the data, transplant was basically a medical trial and error versus an actual medical practice. Doctors didn't really know what they were doing. They basically invented cyclosporine to fight off things that were going on with infections. And then they also needed to fight off the things that were going on with what is called rejection, which is where the body tries to basically get rid of the foreign entity that is stuffed inside of it. So after that, the tech age took off in about the 2000s, and we start to see so much information being shared that the medical advancement is incredible. And currently, we are transplanting nearly 40,000 people per year, which is absolutely insane compared to the few dozen that were initially done in the 1960s. So less than 60 years later, after the first transplant, we're seeing multiple thousands of percent increase in the actual ability for doctors to do transplants. And thankfully that we are able to do those because thousands of people have been saved by transplant. And it's incredibly lucky that we are able to do what we're able to do with medical history today. And here's my bibliography, just mostly stuff from UNOS and a lot of stuff from the Life Center Northwest, and then also a few things from medical doctors. But yeah, feel free to check out UNOS, and please, 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 if you feel inclined to do so, go and register as an organ donor.